getting in touch with Fred, talking to Fred on text messages mostly. He was in jail, and I can't remember if I had a phone call. I think I had one phone call toward the end. What I learned was exactly what he said on that interview, was that he was mentioning a person who was no longer alive, claiming that he knew where Summer was, that it was at a cave in Laurel Run Park.
What if the truth about Summer Wells was never hidden in the shadows, but scattered in plain sight across contradictory testimonies, secret family ties, and careless confessions? In this investigation, we will follow the trail of Fred Hill's slip about an injury no one was supposed to know, the unexplained fortune surrounding Cotton Simpson's death, and the ghost-like role of Marvin Simpson, who vanishes at every critical moment. We'll confront Candace Wells's haunting promise that Summer will come back, and weigh the possibility of an underground adoption under CPS pressure. Each chapter of this story tackles one unresolved question. Piece by piece, we assemble the puzzle. By the end, the picture that emerges may finally explain what happened to Summer Wells. It takes only one slip of the tongue to unravel an entire story, and in the case of Fred Hill, that slip came during a late-night interview with Prayer Garden of America. In the middle of recounting the circumstances around the death of Roy Cotton Simpson, Fred casually mentioned something that, according to the host, had never been made public. He said Cotton had a gash in the back of his head. That phrase might sound minor, but for anyone who has studied true crime, it carries enormous weight. In criminal investigations, certain details are deliberately withheld from the public record so that investigators can separate rumor from reality. If someone mentions the withheld fact, they reveal themselves as having knowledge that should only belong to direct witnesses, perpetrators, or law enforcement insiders. So how could Fred have known about a wound to the back of Cotton's skull if it had never been disclosed? Did he see it himself? Did someone with access confide in him? Or was he involved in the circumstances that caused it? Fred was not a direct member of the Wells family, nor was he an immediate member of the Simpson clan. But through a string of YouTube interviews and jailhouse conversations, he became a recurring character in both narratives. At one point, he was even communicating directly with true crime streamers via a text device while incarcerated, offering to help searchers locate Summer Wells in caves around Laurel Run Park. His comments repeatedly circled back to Cotton Simpson and to Marvin Simpson, as if he could never quite separate one case from the other. This is what made Fred such an important figure. He was the unexpected crossroads, the point where two tragedies intersected, and he seemed unable to keep his knowledge contained. That inability to restrain himself was on full display in the very same Prayer Garden interview. When asked about the cemetery where Cotton's parents were buried, Fred initially claimed he wasn't sure, that he didn't know exactly where they lay. He hesitated, acted uncertain, even gave the impression of a man detached from local geography. Yet minutes later, his words shifted. He named roads, Mountain View, Sandy Road. He recalled landmarks like Bowers Cemetery, and spoke of the church across from Cotton's old property. Anyone raised in rural Tennessee knows that cemeteries and churches are part of the landscape of memory. They are never forgotten. For Fred to act ignorant and then later describe them so precisely was not just odd, it was suspicious. It is this pattern that marks Fred's speech. He oscillates between, "I don't know," and "I know exactly." The act of disavowing knowledge only to later confirm it suggests either nervousness, poor memory, or something more troubling, an attempt to manage information, to distance himself publicly while still betraying what he truly knows. When combined with the mention of Cotton's head wound, the contradictions take on a darker edge. Mentioning a wound in the back of Cotton's head was not speculation. It was a factual statement about an injury not released to the public. There are only a few possible routes by which Fred could have gained that knowledge. Perhaps someone inside the investigation shared it with him, though that seems unlikely given his outsider status. Perhaps the rumor mill of a small community leaked the information, though again, this detail was described specifically non-public. Or, and this is the most chilling explanation, perhaps Fred's knowledge came from direct experience. He might have been present when Cotton was found, or worse, when Cotton was fatally injured. This is why law enforcement compelled Fred to take a polygraph. It was recalled that Fred himself admitted he was forced to sit for a lie detector test in relation to Cotton's death. Authorities don't polygraph random neighbors. They administer that test when someone knows more than they should, when inconsistencies in their story raise red flags. If Fred casually dropped an unreleased detail about a fatal injury, that alone would be reason enough to test him. The implications of Fred's slip extend far beyond the mystery of Cotton's death. Fred repeatedly claimed that Cotton knew something about Summer Wells, that Cotton had allegedly said when Summer was found, people would immediately know who was responsible. Within weeks, Cotton himself was dead. Was his death simply bad luck? A tragic accident in the woods? Or was it the silencing of a man who threatened to connect too many dots? If Cotton truly possessed knowledge about Summer's fate, Fred may have inherited that knowledge by proximity. And if Fred was willing to reveal a hidden fact about Cotton's death, perhaps he also holds hidden facts about Summer's disappearance. At best, Fred comes across as a man who cannot control his tongue. He talks too much, contradicts himself, and lets slip pieces of information that should never be in his possession. At worst, his knowledge suggests direct involvement in events far darker than he admits. Whether he is an insider by accident or by action, he hovers at the edge of two tragedies like a reluctant gatekeeper of the truth. This first slip, the mention of a gash in the back of the head, is more than a stray detail. It is a fracture line in the narrative, a place where a hidden truth breaks the surface. It is what transforms Fred from a mere talker into a potential insider, someone whose words may hold the key to connecting Cotton's death with Summer's disappearance. And it is the reason why his contradictions, his half-ignorance followed by sudden precision, must be examined as more than simple confusion. They are the marks of someone balancing between denial and revelation. The story of Fred Hill's slip doesn't just stop with Cotton. It echoes into the Wells family itself. Because just as Fred is the man who knows too much, on the Simpson side of the case, there is someone within the Wells family who also cannot stop repeating a phrase that sounds less like comfort and more like a clue. That person is Candace Wells. And the phrase is the haunting promise she has delivered time and again: Summer will come back. When Fred Hill slipped out a detail he should never have known about Cotton Simpson's head wound, suspicion naturally gathered around him. But there is another figure in this story who also speaks too much, someone whose words echo like a strange riddle, repeated until they no longer sound like comfort, but instead like a clue. That person is Candace Wells, the mother of the missing child at the center of it all. According to the commentary, Candace has made a habit of repeating the same phrase, "Summer will come back." Time and again, she insists that her daughter is still alive, that her return is inevitable, and that when that happens, everyone who has accused her and Dawn of wrongdoing will owe them an apology. The insistence is not a one-time slip, nor a fleeting expression of hope. It is a refrain, a line she falls back on, one that seems to carry more weight than the typical wishful thinking of a grieving parent. One YouTuber reacted with obvious frustration to Candace's repetition. He argued bluntly that even if Summer were to walk back through the door tomorrow, he would not apologize to Candace or Dawn. The way he saw it, the couple's behavior in the aftermath of their daughter's disappearance, drunken live streams, public squabbles, reckless statements, had destroyed any claim they had to sympathy. His words were harsh, but they reflect the broader sentiment in the true crime community. Many believe the Wells parents forfeited respect through their actions, and no amount of "I told you so" rhetoric could win it back. In that light, Candace's repeated demand for future apologies doesn't just sound hollow, it sounds calculated. The most striking part of this refrain is how one-sided it appears. It emphasizes that Candace is the one who returns to this promise again and again, while Don rarely, if ever, frames his language in the same way. Don has his own collection of bizarre and troubling statements, such as the chilling remark that he knew 4 months before Summer's disappearance that something was going to happen to her, but he does not cling to the mantra of her eventual return. The asymmetry raises a natural question. Why does Candace feel compelled to repeat the idea so forcefully when Dawn does not? This imbalance inside the Wells household could be read in several ways. It might point to differences in coping style, Candace needing to assert hope as a defense mechanism, Dawn leaning into fatalism. It might also suggest a gap in information. Perhaps Candace knows something Dawn does not. Or perhaps Dawn knows the truth and chooses silence, while Candace struggles to carry it alone. When a family presents such a public face of dysfunction, it is difficult to know which interpretation is closest to reality, but the imbalance is undeniable and cannot be dismissed as coincidence. There are at least 3 major possibilities for how to interpret Candace's repeated claim. The first, and most unsettling, is that Candace may actually know where Summer is, or at least know who has her. Asking whether Candace's confidence could come from knowledge of an underground arrangement. If Candace has maintained contact with whoever holds Summer, her insistence on a reunion is not merely hope. It is a veiled truth she is unwilling to spell out. That would also explain why she expects apologies. She believes that when Summer reappears, it will exonerate her. The second possibility is less conspiratorial, but no less revealing. Candace's repetition may be a psychological defense, a mantra she uses to shield herself from unbearable reality. By telling herself and others that Summer is coming back, she deflects accusations, silences doubts, and buys time. In this interpretation, the refrain is less about communication with the outside world and more about self-preservation. It is a mask of certainty worn over a face of guilt, fear, or despair. The third possibility is more strategic still. Candace could be preparing the public narrative for a potential reappearance of Summer through unofficial channels. As some speculate, Summer was handed to another party in a kind of underground adoption. Her eventual discovery might not come through official law enforcement but by accident, tip-off, or media exposure. By repeating, "Summer will come back," Candace conditions the audience to expect this outcome, and by extension, to interpret it as vindication rather than exposure. In this sense, the refrain is not denial but propaganda, a softening of the ground for a twist ending she believes is inevitable. None of these possibilities can be confirmed outright, but each is troubling in its own way. If Candace knows, then she is withholding critical information. If she is protecting herself, then she is living in a self-created delusion that harms the investigation. If she is preparing the public, then she is weaponizing her daughter's potential return as a shield against accountability. The haunting part is how insistent she is. Parents of missing children often cling to hope, but they usually express it as longing. "I hope she comes back. Please bring her home." Candace's phrasing is different. It is not, "I hope." It is, "She will." It is declarative, definitive, and unyielding. The line between hope and knowledge is thin, and Candace's words consistently fall on the side of knowledge. The way to interpret this is arrogant, as a request for sympathy she doesn't deserve. But if we step back and analyze it, the arrogance could be a mask for something else entirely. Sometimes those who know a truth they cannot say aloud project it in the form of repeated phrases, as if they are daring others to piece it together. Candace may be doing precisely that. Fred ties the Wells case to the Simpsons by claiming Cotton knew something about Summer's fate. Candace ties herself to the future of the case by promising Summer's return. Between them, they weave a narrative of concealed truths and public slips. Fred may have revealed what happened to Cotton, and Candace may be hinting at what really happened to Summer. This is why her repetition matters. It is not just a grieving mother clinging to hope. It is a puzzle piece in a larger pattern of people who say too much while pretending to know too little. It is the Wells family's version of Fred's gash in the back of the head. And it begs the same question. If they know this much, where did that knowledge come from? The investigation cannot stop at analyzing Candace's words in isolation. It must follow the trail of connections, because words do not exist in a vacuum. If Candace's refrain is a signal that Summer is alive, then the death of Cotton Simpson becomes even more suspicious. Cotton was said to have known something about Summer's location, even suggesting that once she was found the guilty party would be obvious. Shortly afterward, he was dead. If Candace's confidence is genuine, Could Cotton's demise have been the price of knowing too much? As we move into the next chapter, this is the bridge we must cross. The same way Fred's slip revealed more than he intended, Candace's repetition may reveal more than she intends. And if both figures hold pieces of truth, the connection between them may explain why one man lies buried in Laurel Run, and why one little girl has never come home. The further we step into this story, the harder it becomes to believe in coincidences. Roy Cotton, Simpson's death, is one of those moments that resists simple explanation. Officially, he died near Laurel Run Park, not far from Bower Cemetery, and it was said that hikers stumbled upon his body. But the circumstances are wrapped in layers of rumor, contradiction, and whispered motives. If we strip away the noise, we are still left with three haunting possibilities. Cotton fell by accident, Cotton was killed for money, or Cotton was silenced because he knew too much. The most striking piece of evidence remains the injury itself. In part 1, we examined how Fred Hill revealed that Cotton had a gash in the back of his head, a detail that was not meant to be public. The presence of such a wound raises immediate questions. If Cotton had merely slipped off a cliff, why was the emphasis on a blow to the back of his skull? Could it have been the impact of a fall? Possibly. But could it also have been a strike delivered before or during that fall? Equally possible. The ambiguity is exactly what makes the wound so significant, and why Fred's casual disclosure sounded more like a confession than an anecdote. Then there is the question of money. It presents conflicting accounts of Cotton's financial state in the days before his death. Some say he was broke, barely scraping by, while others insist he had anywhere from $5,000 to $16,000 in cash on him. At one point, Fred himself spoke of Cotton having around $5,000, though in other conversations he suggested otherwise. Bank records reportedly showed only about $2,000 left in an account, fueling further speculation. Why does this matter? Because if Cotton did carry that much cash, it offers a clear motive for robbery. A man flush with money, nervous about being robbed, found dead the next day. It is not difficult to draw a line between those points. What makes the money theory even more suspicious is the story of Cotton's last night alive. According to Fred, Cotton stopped by his house the evening before his death. Cotton was interested in buying a boat, nervous about carrying cash, and confided in Fred that he feared being robbed. Fred says he and Marvin decided to follow Cotton to make sure he made it home safely. Yet here is where the logic begins to fray. If their goal was to protect him, why did they follow him without telling him? Why did they stop at a crossroads, a stop sign near Mountain View Road, and then simply turn back, leaving him to drive on alone? This contradiction lies at the heart of suspicion. If Cotton was truly anxious about his money, and Fred and Marvin were aware of it, then their story about protecting him makes little sense. To protect someone, you walk beside them, not behind them in secret. The image of two men trailing a nervous acquaintance, then halting as he continues on his way, sounds less like guardianship and more like pursuit. Beyond robbery, there is the darker theory of banned substances. Records allegations that Cotton may have been sold hot banned substances cut or tainted, potentially lethal. Some claimed Betty Jo Simpson was suspected of providing it, while others believed Fred was the real supplier. In this version, Cotton's death was not a matter of falling or being struck, but of ingesting something poisonous. This theory fits with the wider narrative of banned substances circulating in the community, of lives unraveling in patterns of addiction. Yet even if Cotton overdosed or reacted to adulterated banned substances, that would not explain why Fred seemed to know about a gash on his head. Unless both elements were true, a fall after using, or a confrontation tied to banned substances that ended violently. The third possibility is the most chilling, that Cotton was silenced because he knew something about Summer Wells. Fred has often repeated that Cotton claimed to know where Summer was, or at least to know the truth about what happened to her. Cotton is quoted as saying that once Summer was found, everyone would immediately know who was responsible. Statements like that are dangerous. They turn a man into a liability. If Cotton really did hold information about Summer's fate, and if he threatened to reveal it, Then his death takes on an entirely new dimension. No longer an accident, no longer about money or banned substances, but a deliberate silencing. To accept that theory is to believe that two tragedies, Cotton's death and Summer's disappearance, are intertwined, bound together by secrets too dangerous to leave alive. It is an unsettling possibility, but one that cannot be dismissed. Fred's own narrative fuels it. He connects Cotton to Summer, then describes being forced to take a polygraph after Cotton's death. He reveals injury details that should have been private. He portrays himself as both close to Cotton and yet strangely detached when Cotton most needed protection. Every part of the story points in two directions at once, leaving us unsure which version is the mask and which is the truth. What we are left with is not a single conclusion, but a trident of possibilities. Cotton may have died by accident, slipping and hitting his head. He may have been killed for his money, a victim of greed. Or he may have been silenced, his knowledge of Summer's fate too dangerous to leave unspoken. What unites them all is the presence of Fred Hill and Marvin Simpson, men who place themselves near the center of the story, yet consistently distance themselves from responsibility. Key is that none of these explanations can be ruled out. Accident remains possible, but the money trail raises eyebrows. Banned substances remain plausible, but the gash detail complicates the picture. Silencing is the darkest theory, but Cotton's own words about Summer make it hard to ignore. What matters most is that these are not baseless speculations. They arise directly from the accounts preserved, words spoken by those closest to the events. They are theories born from contradiction, not invention. And so we arrive at the bridge to the next chapter. If Cotton's death was linked to his knowledge of Summer's fate, then we must examine what that fate might have been. If he was silenced for speaking too much, then what truth was he trying to tell? It suggests one disturbing possibility, that Summer was not taken by strangers at all, but given away in an underground adoption, facilitated through churches or sympathetic outsiders. If Cotton hinted at such an arrangement, and if Candace's repeated insistence that Summer will come back is rooted in that same hidden truth, then his death may not have been about money or banned substances at all. It may have been about protecting the secret of a child deliberately placed beyond the reach of law. When the idea of an underground adoption first surfaced, it sounded more like rumor than reality. Yet the more one looks at the circumstances surrounding Summer's disappearance, the harder it becomes to dismiss the possibility outright. Was this truly a random abduction from a rural Tennessee hilltop, or could she have been deliberately handed over, moved quietly into another household through back channels that bypass the law? Two potential pathways are most often discussed. The first runs through the church. Don and Candace were known to lean on religious institutions in moments of crisis. They sought comfort in congregations, relied on pastors for emotional support, and attempted to portray themselves as repentant believers in the wake of their daughter's disappearance. It would not be unusual for parents under pressure to turn to such a network, seeking sympathy, advice, or even a way out of a desperate situation. Churches, particularly in small towns, are built on trust. Families confide in each other. A plea of, "We just can't manage anymore," might be heard as an opportunity for someone in the congregation, well-meaning or otherwise, to step in and take a child off their hands. In such a context, Summer could have been absorbed into another family under the guise of charity, hidden under layers of piety. The second pathway is the internet. Before Summer vanished, there was a video clip that drew attention. The little girl dancing beside a barrel with the words, "For sale," painted on it. To some viewers it looked like a cruel joke, to others, a dark advertisement. Even if it was innocent on the surface, moments like these, combined with the Wells family's history of oversharing online, created a digital trail that strangers could easily exploit. All it would take is one sympathetic soul, someone convinced by Candace or Don's stories of hardship, to reach out with an offer. "We'll take her. We'll raise her. She'll be safe here." Such an arrangement might seem far-fetched, but in the age of private chat groups, encrypted messages, and online forums, it is hardly impossible. The chilling part of this theory is that Don himself once claimed he knew months in advance that something was going to happen to Summer. 4 months, to be exact. That kind of statement is not the language of accident or coincidence. 4 months is a window of preparation, a span of time long enough to make plans, clear tracks, and create a cover story. If Don's words are to be taken literally, they imply not foreboding but foreknowledge. Something was being arranged, and he knew it. Imagine how such a plan could unfold. A family under pressure from Child Protective Services, fearful of losing custody of all their children, chooses to place one child out of reach. As a desperate measure, over the course of months, they identify a channel, either a church member trusted enough to keep the secret, or an online contact convinced they are helping. They craft their narrative: struggling parents, unable to cope, facing intervention by the state. They build in excuses in case the arrangement is ever discovered, claims of ignorance about official alerts, insistence that they were merely seeking help, framing themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. By the time June arrived, the groundwork was already in place. All it required was one afternoon of misdirection and silence. Of course, those who defend this theory acknowledge its fragility. To claim ignorance of something as public as an Amber Alert would stretch credibility. To pass off the deliberate handover of a child as help would not withstand serious legal scrutiny. Yet the very audacity of such a defense might be its strength. In small circles, in private conversations, in whispered assurances, it could be enough to convince a participant that they were not doing anything wrong. After all, if the parents themselves insisted it was only temporary, if they swore they were trying to protect their daughter from state intervention, a caregiver might be persuaded to believe they were part of a rescue, not a crime. This is why the underground adoption theory persists. It provides answers where other explanations stumble. Why did Candace so confidently insist that Summer would return? Because she believed her daughter was not dead but merely hidden. Why did Don speak of foreknowledge months in advance? Because he knew a plan was being formed. Why has no trace of Summer turned up despite exhaustive searches in the surrounding woods? Because she was never in those woods to begin with. Still, this remains a theory, not a verdict. It is speculation born of inconsistencies and gaps. There is no signed paper, no recorded handover, no confession. What it offers is plausibility, not proof. But plausibility is enough to force us to widen the lens, to look beyond the narrow frame of a child vanishing into the forest. It makes us ask whether the disappearance was not an outside job, but an inside choice. If such a pathway did exist, it could not have functioned in isolation. Someone local would have had to facilitate it, someone with knowledge of the terrain, the families, the patterns of law enforcement, and the blind spots in community oversight. Someone who could act as a guide, smoothing the way, covering the traces. That brings us inevitably to Marvin Simpson, the man whose name surfaces again and again in the shadows of this case, always near the action yet never fully visible. Every story like this has a ghost, a person who is present in every rumor, every conversation, every timeline, but who never stands still long enough to face real questions. In the tangled web surrounding Summer Wells and the mysterious death of Cotton Simpson, that ghost is Marvin Simpson. His name surfaces whenever details turn sensitive. He is described as a guide, a knower of caves, a man tied to properties and paperwork. Yet whenever investigators or independent searchers try to pin him down, he simply isn't there. Fred Hill himself introduced Marvin as the man who knew the caves of Laurel Run. According to Fred, Marvin could take searchers directly to hidden places, the kinds of spots that might conceal something, or someone, important. At one point, Marvin even agreed to meet an investigator and lead the way. The time was set, the plan arranged, but when the day arrived, Marvin didn't show. No explanation, no cancellation, just silence. The no-show became a pattern. Marvin could be spoken about endlessly, but he could never be made to stand in the spotlight. The evasiveness is not the only troubling part. At one stage, Fred sent a text message to a searcher that included the phrase, "Help clear our name." The "or" is what catches attention. Whose name needed clearing? Fred's alone. Or Fred's and Marvin's together? By tying himself to Marvin with a single pronoun, Fred suggested that whatever shadows followed him also followed Marvin. If Fred had reason to feel accused in the death of Cotton or in the disappearance of Summer, why did he instinctively speak of or name? It implies a shared burden, perhaps even a shared secret, something both men would need to wash away. Then, there is the matter of the paperwork. Digging into records tied to Ben Hill Road, specifically number 205, near the Wells property, reveals Marvin Simpson's name on septic system documents. The details matter. The paperwork is dated 2016 and includes a note about a red pickup truck. The property is marked as abandoned, but still private. On the surface, these are ordinary bureaucratic entries. But in context, they paint a far more intriguing picture. Marvin's connection to the land through septic installation would have given him unique knowledge of the terrain, the underground systems, the tanks and pipes hidden from casual view. In a rural hollow where searches focused mostly on woods and fields, such hidden infrastructure might be the most overlooked yet most important. What does this mean? At minimum, Marvin's name on those documents ties him physically and legally to the land around the Wells home. He wasn't just a neighbor or a passerby, he was someone who had direct reason to access, inspect, or work beneath the surface. That connection alone should have made him a figure of interest. Add to that the persistent references from Fred, the strange insistence that Marvin was the man who could guide people to the caves, and the fact that Marvin never once appeared to answer those questions, and the picture grows even darker. Why does Marvin avoid the spotlight? Fear is one explanation. Perhaps he wants no part of gossip and conspiracy, and his absence is self-preservation. But if that were true, why is his name everywhere? Why does Fred pull him back into the narrative, again and again, almost as if trying to share the weight of suspicion? Another explanation is loyalty to family. The Simpsons are a tightly woven clan, and names like Betty Jo and Nate repeat in connection to Cotton's final days. In small communities, loyalty can override everything, including law. Silence may not just be Marvin's choice, it may be the family's code. The story of Marvin also forces us to consider how these cases overlap. If Cotton was silenced because he knew too much about Summer, then who else knew? If Fred was tested because he revealed too much, who shared the weight of his knowledge? Marvin stands at the intersection of those questions. His absence is not neutrality, it is the shape of a man outlined by everything said around him. Consider again the red pickup note in the septic documents. Pickup trucks are common in Tennessee, but a red pickup has been mentioned in other rumors tied to Summer's disappearance. To see it noted in paperwork linked to Marvin is unsettling, a small piece of corroboration that whispers instead of shouts. Was it coincidence? Perhaps. Or was it a breadcrumb, an unintentional trace of a vehicle that mattered? These are the small connections investigators thrive on, the details that transform random gossip into lines of inquiry. And then there is the year, 2016. Long before Summer's disappearance, Marvin's name was already etched into the landscape of Ben Hill Road. That history gives him a presence that cannot be denied, even if he never steps into the camera's frame. It means he isn't just a background character. He was there, on paper, with cause to access and knowledge of the ground. All of this leaves us with the central question: what is Marvin afraid of? Is it exposure of direct involvement, fear of being wrongly accused, or terror of betraying family secrets? His silence leaves us guessing, but the weight of evidence suggests more than simple shyness. His absence speaks louder than most people's words. As Marvin's shadow deepens, it forces us to look at the Wells family again, and how their own public behavior has clouded the investigation. While Marvin vanishes whenever the spotlight turns his way, Don and Candace do the opposite. They appear online, drunk, belligerent, self-destructive, offering the world a theater of dysfunction. Marvin hides, but the Wells broadcast their collapse. Each posture, absence, and spectacle raises its own questions. Is Marvin's silence guilt, and is the Wells chaos camouflage? Or are both simply symptoms of people crushed by pressure, acting out in ways they can no longer control? Until he is brought fully into the light, the story remains half-told. And while he stays in the shadows, the Wells' chaotic performance online becomes the counterpoint, an opposite strategy to the same end, avoiding the kind of clear, consistent accountability that could finally resolve what happened to Summer Wells. While Marvin Simpson disappears into silence, Dawn and Candace Wells take the opposite route. They appear everywhere, often in the worst possible light. Instead of retreating from public view, they open their home to cameras, join live streams late at night, and broadcast themselves in states that make them look less like grieving parents and more like self-destructive performers. The result has been devastating for their credibility. Observers have not been kind. Many voices online echo the same sentiment. Even if Summer walked back into their arms tomorrow, no apology would be owed to them. Their conduct in the aftermath of her disappearance has been so reckless, so at odds with the expectations of desperate parents, that the public has branded them unfit. They are not seen as victims of tragedy, but as architects of chaos. Examples are plentiful. There are recordings of live streams where Dawn and Candace appear intoxicated, slurring their words, arguing openly, sometimes with strangers who dial in simply to provoke them. Instead of projecting dignity or determination, they perform dysfunction. At one point, they boasted about traveling for work in Virginia, presenting it as a kind of stability, yet this new start crumbled almost as soon as it began. Employment was never consistent, responsibilities were rarely followed through. And all the while the most pressing duty, the search for their daughter, seemed to recede into the background. The image they projected was not of parents consumed with finding a missing child, but of people consumed with themselves. Why would they behave this way? 3 explanations present themselves. The first is the simplest: they are genuinely irresponsible, products of habits too entrenched to break even under tragedy. Alcohol, poor decision-making, and volatility are part of their normal lives, and so it continued after Summer vanished. In this interpretation, there is no grand design, only dysfunction. The second is more deliberate. What if the chaos is a smokescreen? By flooding the internet with scenes of drunken quarrels, outrageous statements, and pitiful pleas, Dawn and Candace may have shifted attention away from harder questions. While people debated their antics, speculated about their marriages, or mocked their behavior, conversations about Marvin, Cotton, and the caves grew quieter. It is not unthinkable that self-destruction could double as distraction. In this view, their outrageous presence online is not just carelessness, but a calculated form of misdirection. The third explanation lies somewhere between psychology and survival. Facing relentless accusations, attacked in comment sections and forums, perhaps Dawn and Candace lashed out not to manipulate but to cope. Their public meltdowns may be less about strategy than about defense. When you are already condemned by the court of public opinion, one way to protect yourself is to stop trying altogether, give the critics a show, drown your despair in alcohol, and let the world think what it will. That too is a kind of shield, ugly but functional. Whichever explanation is correct, the outcome has been the same. Public trust has collapsed. Each time they appeared intoxicated, each time they chose to argue instead of advocate, each time they indulged in spectacle instead of silence, they confirmed the worst assumptions about themselves. Even those who might have been sympathetic at the start turned away. They lost not only the benefit of the doubt, but also the fragile respect that missing children's cases demand. The irony is that in destroying their own image, Dawn and Candace strengthened the very theories they wanted to escape. Their behavior became evidence in itself. To many observers, parents who truly wanted their child back would not act this way. The more they spiraled online, the more people became convinced that something darker was being hidden. In that sense, their YouTube presence has been one of the most powerful forces shaping public opinion, not toward innocence, but toward suspicion. And yet, in all the noise, something else was happening beneath the surface. While Dawn and Candace were busy burning their credibility in the public eye, Fred Hill kept spinning his tale about caves in Laurel Run. The contrast is stark. On one side, chaos visible to everyone. On the other, whispers about hidden places and secret burials. Which of these deserves more attention? Are Dawn and Candace simply reckless parents who can't control themselves? Or are they active participants in a larger strategy, smoke and mirrors above ground, while the real story remains buried below? This is the transition point. As the Wells parents play their destructive theater for an audience of strangers, Fred's narrative of the cave lingers like an unanswered riddle. If the drunken live streams are the distraction, then the cave may be the clue. The next question is simple but profound. Is the story of Laurel Run a genuine lead, or just another carefully placed decoy? For months, one word kept resurfacing in Fred Hill's story, cave. He insisted that Summer Wells might have been hidden in one of the limestone hollows scattered around Laurel Run Park. Again and again, he returned to this image, as if the cave itself was a character in the story, a place waiting to be discovered. But the more closely people followed Fred's directions, the less sense they made. Fred repeatedly directed people toward Laurel Falls. His instructions were confident: go this way, past the waterfall, toward a spot he claimed would reveal the entrance. But those familiar with the area, including a local couple who knew where Cotton's body had been found, pointed out that the supposed cave lay in the opposite direction. The site where Cotton fell, or was pushed, or struck, was not past Laurel Falls at all. Fred's route was wrong from the start. If he truly wanted someone to discover the cave, why would he point them the wrong way? This pattern played out more than once. On paper, Fred had all the detail in the world, landmarks, names, even distances. But in practice, anyone who followed his breadcrumbs ended up off track. It was as if his words were a compass that spun deliberately, guiding investigators away from the very places they most wanted to see. One searcher decided to test Fred's guidance personally. He strapped on his boots, packed a sidearm for safety, and set off into the forest alone. The terrain was steep, the canopy dense, the ground slick from recent rain. For a time the direction seemed plausible, but then the strangeness began. He heard footsteps behind him, not just one set but two, steady and deliberate. At first he thought it was coincidence, hikers traveling the same path. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became that he was not simply sharing a trail. Someone was following him. With each step, the sensation grew stronger. He was being tracked, watched, perhaps even tested. His hand rested on the grip of his weapon, more for reassurance than intent. At last, when he reached what Fred had promised would be the cave, he found only a secondary waterfall, beautiful but barren of secrets. No opening, no chamber, nothing but rushing water and stone. The cave, if it existed, was not here. The sense of being followed lingered, but the destination was a dead end. This wasn't just a failed hike. It was a performance. The wrong turn, the unseen men in the forest, the absence of the cave, all of it added up to the possibility that Fred's directions were not meant to reveal anything. They were meant to waste time, to create the illusion of cooperation while hiding something else entirely. The suspicion deepens when paired with Fred's now infamous message: help clear our name. He used it while referencing Marvin, the man who never showed when it mattered. Was the cave story part of that same effort? An elaborate decoy meant to present Fred and Marvin as helpful guides rather than potential suspects. If you send someone on a wild chase through the woods and they come back empty-handed, you can shrug and say, well, at least we tried. It gives the appearance of transparency without the substance. It is, in other words, a tactic of misdirection. Of course, the cave itself may not be a total invention. Laurel Run is riddled with sinkholes and small caverns. Locals know that tucked-away hollows do exist, often used by teenagers or hunters. So it is entirely possible that a cave is there, waiting to be found. But what matters is not the existence of the cave. It is the fact that the coordinates Fred provided were wrong, perhaps deliberately. A real cave may exist, but Fred never truly led anyone to it. The cave narrative also served another purpose. It kept the community hooked. As long as there was the promise of a hidden chamber, a place where answers might be stashed, there was reason for people to keep talking about Fred, to keep engaging with him, to keep him at the center of the conversation. For a man under suspicion, attention can be a form of control. As long as people were debating caves, they weren't scrutinizing every detail of Cotton's death, or Marvin's paperwork, or Fred's own polygraph. This is the bitter truth about the Laurel Run cave story. Whether or not a cave exists, the directions and the drama around it appear designed to serve Fred and Marvin more than they served the search for Summer. They provided cover. They created narrative. They bought time. The cave was less about discovery than about diversion. That conclusion does not end the mystery, of course. It simply moves the question up a level. If the cave was a decoy, then why bother? What was so urgent, so dangerous, that a decoy had to be built in the first place? If Fred and Marvin needed to clear our name, what stain were they trying to scrub away? If the cave story was meant to distract, what were they distracting from? The answer may lie not underground, but in the relentless pressure above ground. The pressure of Child Protective Services, the risk of losing all parental rights, the fear of children being scattered through the foster system. For Dawn and Candace Wells, that pressure was constant. If the cave story was a smokescreen, the real fire may have been the plan they felt forced to make under CPS oversight. And so the trail leads us out of the woods and into the courtroom, the social worker's office, the tense meetings where families are warned that their children will be removed. If Summer's disappearance was not the work of a stranger, if it was not an accident, then it may have been a desperate choice forged under official scrutiny. A cave may not hide the truth, but bureaucracy might explain it. In any missing child investigation, one element often overlooked by the public but crucial behind the scenes is the role of Child Protective Services. Long before Summer disappeared, the Wells family had been under scrutiny. Social workers had visited the home multiple times, noting conditions that raised red flags: unstable employment, lack of structure in the children's education, and the constant presence of alcohol and substances. Each report added another layer to the family's file, inching them closer to the state's decision to remove the children. For Candace, the threat was not theoretical. She had already lost children before. That history made every knock on the door from CPS an echo of past losses. When Summer vanished and her brothers were soon taken into custody, it seemed to confirm what Candace had feared all along: the state was coming for all of them. It is in this atmosphere of fear and inevitability that one of the darkest theories emerges. If Dawn and Candace believed that CPS would take every child, could they have decided to place one daughter off the radar to salvage the rest of the family? It is a cruel, desperate logic: surrender one to save the others. At first, the notion feels unthinkable. Yet desperation can twist moral boundaries. Imagine the scene inside the Wells home: letters of warning piling up, calls from social workers becoming more frequent, and another inspection scheduled on the calendar. Employment was shaky, the environment chaotic, and the family knew their record was against them. In such a setting, it is possible they saw no path forward. To them, CPS wasn't simply oversight, it was an executioner ready to dismantle their household. Out of that dread might come the chilling calculation: if Summer isn't here, then at least the others might be spared. This is not the reasoning of healthy parents. It is the reasoning of people cornered, who believe they are already losing everything. And it is not without precedent. Across the country, there have been cases where parents under CPS pressure sent children to live with distant relatives, friends, or even acquaintances who offered help. In some cases, the children were discovered months or years later, hidden in basements or attics, their guardians insisting they thought they were protecting them. These examples demonstrate that when CPS is seen as an existential threat, some families will gamble with their children's lives rather than surrender them to the system. If the Wells family chose this path, it would not have been an impulsive decision. It would have required weeks or months of dread, growing into a plan. That plan would have been presented not as abandonment, but as preservation. She'll be safe with them, they might have told themselves. When the heat dies down, maybe we'll see her again. It is a self-serving narrative, but desperation breeds self-deception. The question then becomes, how would they carry out such a plan? They could not simply vanish Summer into thin air. They would need intermediaries, people willing to shield the child, to absorb the risk of hiding her, and to keep quiet when the Amber Alert flooded the airwaves. That is where community connections matter most. In small towns, silence is often as powerful as words. A church member, a neighbor, a relative, anyone who believed they were helping. could become the caretaker of a secret that would outlast the initial panic. This theory does not accuse, but it does explain. It explains the certainty in Candace's voice when she insists Summer will come back. It explains the undercurrent of fatalism in Don's remarks about losing his children. It explains why no physical trace of Summer was ever found in the surrounding woods. If she was never meant to be there, then searching those hills would always end in nothing. Still, we must be clear, this remains speculation, not proof. No document, no official report, no witness has confirmed such a handover. But the possibility is compelling because it connects the dots between CPS pressure, the family's history, and the vanishing itself. It reframes the disappearance not as a random crime, but as a desperate strategy. If CPS was the spark that lit this fire, then the next question is who helped fan the flames. Families rarely act alone in matters this complex. To make a child disappear requires assistance, knowledge of the terrain, and above all, loyalty strong enough to override the law. In Hawkins County, one family's name keeps surfacing at every turn: the Simpsons. Their silence, their contradictions, and their proximity suggest they may have been more than bystanders. Every time the story circles back to Laurel Run, one surname keeps multiplying across the map: Simpson. From Betty Jo to Nate, from houses clustered near the cemetery to properties scattered along Sandy Road and Mountain View, the family's presence is everywhere. Their density in that hollow is striking, not just relatives but an entire web of kin, each with overlapping ties, histories, and grudges. And when Cotton Simpson's name enters the conversation, the whole network becomes impossible to ignore. The problem is not simply that the Simpsons were nearby. It is that whenever they speak, their stories clash. One relative says Cotton was nearly broke. Another swears he carried thousands in cash. Some claim he had maybe $2,000 in the bank. Others whisper about 5, 10, even 16,000 in hand. The contradictions stretch beyond money. Accounts of his last night vary wildly: who he visited, which route he drove, and how far Fred and Marvin followed before turning back. Each detail changes depending on who tells it, as if the truth has been divided among them, each holding a fragment, none willing to piece it together. The inconsistencies might be chalked up to memory or gossip, except for one detail that cuts far deeper. Several witnesses have accused Fred Hill of selling Cotton banned substances laced or tainted in a way that made them dangerous. According to this version, Cotton consumed the bad supply and never recovered. Fred, in turn, pointed his finger at Betty Jo Simpson, blaming her for distributing the fatal mixture. The accusation ping-pongs between Fred and Betty Jo, both close enough to know what Cotton took, both eager to redirect suspicion. The fact that this conflict exists at all is extraordinary. Two names, linked by family ties and proximity, openly at odds over who provided the final dose. This is more than rumor. It is a fracture line running through the Simpson circle, a private war disguised as silence. For outsiders, the contradiction is impossible to resolve. But for those inside the hollow, everyone seems to know enough not to press too hard. That silence is telling. It suggests an unspoken pact. Disagreements can rage in whispers, but nothing must be confirmed aloud. Why would the Simpsons maintain this omerta, this code of silence, even when their stories conflict? Fear is one answer. To speak openly about banned substances, money, or foul play risks legal consequences. Protecting family is another. Even when relatives fall out, blood ties often demand loyalty over truth. Then there is the possibility of direct involvement. If multiple members handled Cotton's money, his banned substances, or his movements, then silence becomes self-preservation. And in small communities, where reputation and land mean everything, silence can also be about territory. To admit wrongdoing is to risk losing not just freedom, but standing, property, and power. The result is a paradox. The Simpsons talk plenty, but their words cancel each other out. The true story remains buried beneath contradictions, guarded by the unspoken agreement that outsiders will never get clarity. This is what makes the family such a pivotal piece of the puzzle. It is not that they hold the only truth, but that their unity of silence shields the truth from ever surfacing. The hot dope allegation captures this perfectly. If Cotton's death was the result of tainted banned substances, then someone in that circle knows exactly who supplied them. But rather than risk exposure, each side blames the other and then falls quiet. The circle closes, and the silence resumes. Outsiders are left chasing shadows. One day Fred is guilty, the next Betty Jo, the next Cotton himself for reckless use. The pattern keeps the truth locked inside the family, beyond the reach of investigators who cannot force a confession without proof. The weight of this silence is enormous. It does not just cover the cause of Cotton's death. It may also conceal what Cotton knew about Summer Wells. If Cotton hinted that her disappearance would reveal its culprit, and if he died before revealing more, then the family's contradictions may be protecting more than banned substance deals or debts. They may be protecting knowledge of what really happened to Summer. The refusal to align their stories may not be clumsiness at all. It may be a deliberate way of ensuring that no consistent narrative can be pinned on them. And this is why the Simpson family matters so much to the larger case. Their presence is thickest in the very landscape where Cotton died, in the very roads and cemeteries tied to Fred's confusing directions, in the very community that Don and Candace tried to use as cover. Their silence is not absence, it is participation. Every clash in their accounts, every contradiction about money or banned substances, every refusal to speak in detail is another strand in a web designed to shield them all. We must be cautious. This is not an indictment, it is an observation. The evidence lies in contradictions, not confessions. But patterns matter, and the pattern around the Simpsons is one of conflict without clarity, rumor without resolution, silence without accountability. That silence is as telling as any scream. Which brings us to the final step. When we align every thread, the Wells family under CPS pressure, Fred's slips about injuries and caves, Marvin's evasions, Cotton's money and death, Candace's repeated insistence that Summer will return, and the Simpsons' wall of silence, we begin to see not isolated mysteries, but a single tapestry. The question now is not whether each piece matters, but what the full picture looks like when placed together. To move from speculation to clarity, there must be a method of verification, a series of steps that transform rumor into evidence. The first priority is to confirm the timeline of Fred's most troubling remark, the moment he described the wound on the back of Cotton's head. If that statement was made before the detail ever became public knowledge, it would confirm that Fred possessed insider information he should not have had. Equally important is to compare the directions he gave toward Laurel Falls with the actual site where Cotton was found. If his path was deliberately misleading, rather than a simple mistake, it would speak volumes about his intent. Attention must also turn to the paper trail. The septic records for 215 Ben Hill Road deserve close examination. The date of 2016, Marvin's name listed as applicant or installer, and the reference to a red pickup. Was that note describing a vehicle, a landmark, or something more personal? Every possibility has implications for who had access to the land and when. Marvin himself remains a missing piece of the puzzle. He must be asked directly about his unexplained absence, the day he was meant to guide searchers, about his plea to help clear our name, about his connection to Betty Jo and Nate, and about the cave he claimed to know. Even his silence in the face of such questions would carry meaning. Candace's words also demand systematic analysis. Every time she declared that Summer will come back should be collected and mapped onto a timeline. Did she make those claims before or after specific interventions by Child Protective Services, before or after shifts in employment, before or after the removal of her sons? If a pattern emerges, it may reveal whether her words were desperate coping mechanisms or signals of knowledge she could not speak openly. Finally, the community's whisper network must be tested against itself. Testimony about the so-called hot banned substances needs to be gathered and compared. Who was said to be selling it? Who admitted to using it? Do the stories align with Fred's attempt to blame Betty Jo, or do they point back to him? Drugs do not exist in isolation. They leave trails through social circles, trails that can expose the truth of Cotton's final hours. Each of these steps, pursued carefully and in order, would chip away at the fog of contradictions. They would not only check the validity of statements already made, but also expose where silence hides the truth. Together, they form the path toward either confirming the working hypothesis or dismantling it once and for all.